The rain hammered against the tinted windows of the Pentagon's secondary briefing room, each drop a staccato beat against glass that had witnessed countless classified conversations. Inside, beneath fluorescent lights that turned everyone's skin the color of old paper, a woman sat alone at a conference table designed for 30. Her uniform bore no name tape, no rank insignia, nothing but the trident pin above her left breast pocket that most civilians wouldn't recognize, and most military personnel would assume was decorative. She was 29 years old, though the shadows under her eyes suggested someone who'd lived several lifetimes in compression, and her hands rested flat on the mahogany surface with the deliberate stillness of someone who'd learned to control every micro-expression. The door opened without warning. 3 Marines entered, their dress blues crisp enough to cut glass, led by a staff sergeant whose chest displayed enough ribbons to qualify as a small flag. His eyes swept the room with practiced efficiency before landing on the woman, and something flickered across his face, brief as a camera shutter, quick as contempt. He approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to immediate deference, his polished shoes clicking against tile like a countdown timer. She didn't stand. She didn't even look up. "Ma'am, this briefing room is reserved for command-level personnel," the staff sergeant said, his tone professionally neutral but edged with impatience, the kind of voice that had moved privates and lance corporals for 15 years. "I'm going to need you to clear the area." Still, she didn't move. Her fingers remained pressed against the table's surface, and if you looked closely, you'd notice the faint scars across her knuckles, the kind that don't come from gym equipment or training accidents but from something more intimate, more desperate. "I said, ma'am, you need to." The staff sergeant reached for her shoulder, his hand already descending in that universal gesture of forced compliance, the physical period at the end of a sentence that wasn't actually a request. His fingers were 3 inches from contact when she finally looked up. Her eyes were the color of storm water, gray-blue and absolutely empty of fear, filled instead with something that made the staff sergeant's hand freeze mid-trajectory, as if he'd touched an electric fence. The room's temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees in the space between heartbeats. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice quiet as snowfall, calm as execution orders. The question hung in the air like smoke from a rifle barrel, and in the silence that followed, the Marine's hand slowly lowered to his side. Behind him, his 2 colleagues shifted their weight, sensing a mistake in progress, watching a career moment unfold in real time. The woman's expression hadn't changed at all. She simply waited, patient as geology. The staff sergeant's jaw tightened, and you could see him calculating, running through mental databases of faces and ranks, coming up empty because the briefing documents he'd received hadn't included photographs, only a code name that meant nothing to him until this exact moment. His hand moved toward his cover, an instinctive gesture of respect that his brain hadn't yet authorized, caught between protocol and survival instinct. The woman watched this internal struggle with the detached interest of someone observing a laboratory experiment, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged. "Commander Vance," she said, providing the answer he was desperately searching for, "call sign Keelhaul, and you just put your hands on the officer who's about to brief the Joint Chiefs on Operation Ripcord." She let that information settle like sediment in water, watching comprehension dawn across his face in stages. Confusion, recognition, horror, resignation. "But please, Staff Sergeant Morrison, by all means, continue explaining to me why I don't belong in this room." Her tone never shifted from that same lethal calm, the kind of composure that isn't taught in any manual, but earned in places where emotion gets you killed. Morrison's face had gone the color of ash, that particular shade of gray that comes from realizing you've made a mistake that will echo through your permanent record like a church bell. His hand snapped to a salute so sharp it could have drawn blood, his body locking into the kind of rigid attention usually reserved for flag officers and firing squads. The 2 Marines behind him followed a microsecond later, their movements synchronized by pure muscle memory and the sudden understanding that they'd walked into a situation far above their pay grade. Commander Vance didn't return the salute immediately. She let them stand there, arms raised, while rain continued its assault on the windows and fluorescent lights hummed their electrical hymn. "At ease," she finally said, her voice still carrying that same dangerous quiet, the kind of calm that precedes Category 5 hurricanes. Morrison's arm dropped, but his spine remained steel-rod straight, his eyes fixed on a point approximately 6 inches above her head, the classic position of someone who desperately wished they could rewind the last 3 minutes of their life. Vance stood slowly, and despite being 5'6" to Morrison's 6'2", she somehow filled more of the room, her presence expanding to occupy all available space. "You're not here for the briefing, Staff Sergeant. You're here to escort me to it." "Yes, ma'am," Morrison managed, his voice stripped of its earlier authority, reduced to the basics of military communication. She could have destroyed him right there, could have filed a formal complaint that would turn his career trajectory from ascending to cratering, but something in her expression suggested that wasn't her style. She'd made her point. The lesson had been delivered and received. Everything else would be redundant. She picked up a tablet from the table, its screen dark and revealing nothing, then moved toward the door with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to navigate hostile territory in darkness. The hallway beyond was Pentagon standard, polished floors reflecting overhead lights, walls painted that specific shade of government beige that somehow managed to be both everywhere and nowhere, portraits of former officials watching with painted eyes that judged everything and forgave nothing. Morrison fell into step behind her, maintaining the appropriate 3 paces of distance, his earlier confidence replaced by something that looked like shell shock. The 2 junior Marines flanked them, their faces carefully neutral, already composing the story they'd tell later in the barracks, already knowing it would sound unbelievable even though they'd lived it. Vance's shoes made almost no sound against the tile, while Morrison's clicked like hammer strikes, a rhythm of presence versus stealth. They passed 3 separate security checkpoints, each manned by armed guards who waved them through after checking credentials that Vance produced from a leather folder that looked older than she was. At the final checkpoint, a Navy captain glanced at her tablet, then at Vance herself, and his eyes widened fractionally before he stepped aside without comment. The recognition was instant and absolute. Whatever was on that tablet carried weight that transcended normal military hierarchy. Morrison noticed the captain's reaction and felt another chunk of his certainty crumble away, replaced by the growing understanding that he'd grabbed someone whose importance he couldn't even properly calculate. The main briefing theater loomed ahead, its double doors guarded by 2 Air Force security personnel whose hands rested casually but deliberately near their sidearms. The left door bore a placard, "Classified briefing in progress, cosmic top secret clearance required." Vance approached without hesitation, and the guards opened the doors inward, revealing an amphitheater-style room where approximately 40 senior officers sat in tiered seating, all facing a massive digital display that currently showed a satellite image of somewhere mountainous and hostile-looking. Every head turned as she entered. Morrison and his Marines stopped at the threshold, their role complete, their transportation duty fulfilled. They watched as Commander Vance descended the center aisle toward the podium, her stride confident and unhurried, while officers wearing stars on their shoulders and enough ribbons to wallpaper a room tracked her progress with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright skepticism. She looked impossibly young compared to the weathered faces surrounding her, impossibly small in a room built for giants, but she moved through their attention like a submarine through deep water, unaffected by pressure that would crush lesser vessels. At the podium, she set down her tablet and looked up at the assembled leadership of the United States military's most clandestine operations. A 4-star admiral in the front row leaned forward, his weathered face creased with something that might have been amusement or might have been challenge. "Commander Vance," he said, his voice carrying the gravel texture of someone who'd shouted orders across flight decks for 3 decades. "You're younger than I expected." It wasn't quite an insult, but it wasn't quite a compliment either, hovering in that ambiguous space that senior officers used to test junior personnel to see what they were made of. Vance didn't blink, didn't shift her weight, didn't display even a micro-expression of discomfort. "Sir, I'm older than I look," she replied, her tone perfectly calibrated between respect and self-assurance, "and I've been operational since I was 23. That gives me 6 years of experience that most people don't survive long enough to accumulate." The Admiral's eyes narrowed, reassessing, and then he nodded once, a gesture that somehow granted permission for her to continue existing in that space. She tapped her tablet and the satellite image behind her changed. The new image showed a compound in what looked like Hindu Kush mountain range, approximately 40 structures arranged in a defensive perimeter, surrounded by terrain that made approach from any direction a tactical nightmare. 18 months ago, Vance began, her voice projecting without apparent effort through the amphitheater. A team that officially doesn't exist conducted an operation that officially never happened in a location that officially isn't on this map. Several officers shifted in their seats, recognizing the preamble to information that would require them to sign additional non-disclosure agreements. That operation was successful. The target was neutralized. The team extracted clean. She paused, letting that information settle, watching faces in the crowd process the past tense language, the use of was instead of is, the subtle grammatical clues that signaled complications. 3 weeks ago, that target's number 2 reappeared. Not in Afghanistan, not in Pakistan, not anywhere we expected. Another tap, another image. Surveillance footage of a man in Western clothing walking through what looked like a European train station, his face partially obscured but identifiable enough to send ripples of concern through the audience. Frankfurt, Munich, Prague, Vienna. He's moving through NATO territories like a tourist, and we don't know why. A Marine general in the second row raised his hand, a surprisingly civilian gesture in such a military context. "Commander, if I may, why isn't this being handled through conventional intelligence channels? Why pull a SEAL commander into Pentagon briefings?" The question was valid, but underneath it lived a current of skepticism, the kind that asked without asking, "What makes you special enough to brief us?" Vance had heard variations of this question her entire career, had learned to answer it without getting defensive, without explaining that special didn't mean better, just different, just prepared for different kinds of impossible. "Because, sir, the target isn't running. He's recruiting." She advanced the presentation to a series of photographs, different faces, different locations, all sharing one common element: former special operations personnel from at least 6 different countries, all of them dishonorably discharged or forced into retirement, all of them possessing skills that made them extraordinarily dangerous. He's building something. A private military company, a terror cell, a mercenary outfit, we don't know yet. But he's exclusively targeting personnel who know how we operate, who know our tactics, our capabilities, our limitations. The room had gone silent except for the barely audible hum of climate control systems. Morrison, still standing at the threshold, watched this unfold with the fascinated horror of someone observing a car accident in slow motion. This was the woman he'd tried to physically remove from a briefing room. This was the officer whose shoulder he'd almost grabbed. He felt a cold sweat break out across his back despite the air conditioning, felt his career flash before his eyes like a montage in a film about failure. One of the junior Marines next to him whispered something that might have been a prayer or might have been a profanity. At certain volumes and in certain contexts, they become interchangeable. Vance continued, her delivery neither rushed nor hesitant, simply factual. "The operation I led 18 months ago eliminated their leader but didn't dismantle their network. We cut off the head, but we underestimated the body's ability to function without it." She switched to an organizational chart that looked like something from a corporate presentation, except all the names were redacted, and all the positions were things like acquisition specialist, and logistics coordinator, which, in this context, meant people who acquired targets and coordinated their elimination. This is what we know. This is what we can prove. Another slide. A different chart, this one full of question marks and dotted lines connecting hypothetical positions to potential operatives. This is what we suspect, and the gap between those two slides is why I'm here instead of in the field where I'd prefer to be. That admission carried weight. Commanders didn't usually confess they'd rather be anywhere but briefing rooms, but Vance had apparently calculated that honesty would buy her more credibility than false enthusiasm. She was right. Several officers in the audience nodded almost imperceptibly, recognizing a kindred spirit who understood that real work happened outside of PowerPoint presentations. The four-star admiral who'd first challenged her age spoke again. "What's your recommendation, Commander?" It was the question that separated analysts from operators, the moment where theoretical knowledge had to transform into actionable strategy. Vance didn't hesitate. "We need to insert a small team, no more than 4 operators, into Vienna. We shadow the target, identify his contacts, map his network. We don't engage. We don't disrupt. We gather intelligence until we understand what we're actually dealing with." She paused, and for the first time, something like emotion flickered across her face. "And then, sir, we eliminate them all simultaneously, every single node in the network before they can scatter again." "You're talking about coordinated strikes across multiple NATO countries," an Army colonel observed, his tone suggesting this was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. "The diplomatic complications alone would take months to authorize." Vance nodded, acknowledging the obstacle without conceding to it. "Which is why we need to start the authorization process now, sir. Today. Because every day we delay is another day they recruit someone else, another day they move closer to whatever objective they're working toward." Her fingers tapped against the podium, an unconscious gesture that betrayed the tension she otherwise kept perfectly controlled. The briefing continued for another hour, diving into tactical details, logistical requirements, risk assessments that read like obituaries written in advance. Morrison watched it all from the doorway, watched this woman who barely looked old enough to rent a car explain operational contingencies to officers who'd been waging war since before she was born, and do it with such command presence that none of them questioned her expertise, even when they questioned her conclusions. At one point, she fielded 3 simultaneous challenges from a Navy captain, an Air Force colonel, and a Marine lieutenant colonel, addressing each concern in sequence without losing track of her arguments through line, building a case like constructing a bridge, one logical support at a time. When she finally concluded, closing her tablet with a soft click that somehow filled the entire amphitheater, the 4-star admiral stood. Everyone else followed immediately, 40-plus officers rising in a wave of respect that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with recognition. "Thank you, Commander Vance," the admiral said, his voice carrying genuine appreciation now, the earlier skepticism burned away by the heat of her competence. "We'll take your recommendations under advisement. Expect orders within 48 hours." She saluted, crisp and perfect, holding it while the admiral returned the gesture, then maintaining it while every other officer in the room followed suit. As she walked back up the aisle, officers parted to let her pass, and more than a few extended hands to shake, offering quiet words of good briefing and impressive work, that she accepted with minimal acknowledgement, her focus already shifting to whatever came next. She reached the threshold where Morrison still stood, frozen in a position that was neither attention nor at ease, just paralyzed uncertainty. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the flecks of darker blue in her gray eyes, close enough that her presence felt almost physical. "Staff Sergeant Morrison," she said quietly, her voice pitched for his ears alone, a word of advice from someone who's made plenty of mistakes in her career. He swallowed hard, nodded, waited for the hammer to fall. "When you walk into a room and assume someone doesn't belong there, you're revealing more about your own limitations than theirs. Competence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. She held his gaze for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years, then continued walking, leaving him standing there with that observation echoing in his skull like tinnitus. The junior Marines waited until she turned the corner before releasing breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Morrison remained still for another 10 seconds before his knees threatened to give out entirely. He'd been in firefights in Fallujah and Sangin, had walked through ambush zones and IED-littered roads, had faced death in various mundane and exotic forms, but nothing had quite prepared him for the experience of being quietly, devastatingly wrong in front of someone who chose mercy over justice. One of the Marines finally spoke. "Sarge, we gonna talk about what just happened." Morrison shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed on the empty corridor where Commander Vance had disappeared. "No," he said, his voice rough as gravel roads. "No, we're going to forget every second of this except the lesson." The Marine looked confused but didn't press. Morrison started walking back the way they'd come, his stride less certain now, his earlier confidence replaced by something humbler and potentially wiser. "What lesson, Sarge?" the other Marine asked. Morrison didn't answer immediately, turning the question over in his mind like a puzzle piece that wouldn't quite fit. "That competence is quiet," he finally said, repeating Vance's words almost verbatim, "and that assumptions kill more careers than actual incompetence ever will." They walked in silence after that, 3 Marines processing an encounter that had lasted less than 5 minutes but would influence their decision-making for the rest of their careers. Behind them, in the briefing theater, officers were already drafting authorization requests, setting into motion operations that would span continents and cost millions of dollars, all based on the recommendations of a 29-year-old woman that half of them had never heard of until 45 minutes ago. Commander Vance, meanwhile, had exited the Pentagon through a side entrance, emerging into rain that had softened from assault to mist, turning the parking lot into a watercolor painting of reflected lights and blurred edges. She walked to a nondescript sedan government issue, black, forgettable, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, and for the first time since entering that initial briefing room, she allowed her control to slip slightly. Her breathing deepened, her jaw unclenched, and if you'd been watching closely, you might have noticed her hands trembling just slightly before she forced them still again. The call sign keelhaul hadn't been chosen randomly. In naval tradition, keelhauling was a punishment where sailors were dragged under the ship's hull, scraping barnacles and likely drowning in the process. It was brutal, efficient, and left survivors scarred in ways that never fully healed. She'd earned the call sign during her first deployment, leading a team through an operation that went wrong in every possible way, dragging her unit through hell and bringing them out alive on the other side, though alive was a generous term for what some of them became afterward. The scars on her knuckles weren't from training. They were from punching through a wooden door to reach a teammate who'd stopped responding to radio calls, finding him bleeding out from arterial damage, holding pressure on his femoral artery for 14 minutes while coordinating extraction. She'd saved his life. He'd retired 6 months later with full disability, unable to look at her without remembering that he owed his continued existence to someone who'd physically broken through barriers to reach him. The gratitude had felt like accusation. The call sign stuck because it captured something essential about her leadership style. Effective but traumatic, successful but costly. The kind of commander who achieved objectives while leaving psychological wake turbulence that took years to settle. The Navy had recognized her competence by promoting her rapidly through ranks that usually required decades to traverse. They'd also quietly ensured she commanded teams, not battalions, limiting her influence to small unit operations where her particular brand of relentless effectiveness could be contained. She started the engine finally, pulling out of the parking lot into DC traffic that moved with the sluggish inevitability of government bureaucracy made automotive. The rain had picked up again, forcing her to activate windshield wipers that beat a rhythm almost identical to her resting heart rate, 60 beats per minute. The result of training and trauma combined into physiological efficiency. She drove without conscious navigation, muscle memory taking her through streets she'd memorized during previous assignments, her mind already 3 steps ahead, planning contingencies for operations that hadn't been approved yet, running mental simulations of scenarios that might never manifest. Her phone rang, the sound interrupting thoughts that had been circling the same tactical problems like sharks around chum. She answered through the car's Bluetooth, not checking the caller ID because only 4 people had this number and all of them were important enough to warrant immediate response. Keelhaul, she said, using the call sign because formal names felt false, because she'd been that person longer than she'd been the woman her parents had named at birth. The voice that responded was male, gravelly, familiar in the way that old injuries become familiar, constant, slightly painful, impossible to ignore. "Saw your briefing notes," the voice said without preamble, without identification because he knew she'd recognize him instantly. Master Chief Marcus Wade, her first commanding officer, the man who'd trained her before she'd become whatever she was now. "You're going to Vienna." It wasn't a question. Classified briefing materials weren't supposed to leak, but Wade had been in special operations for 30 years and had cultivated information sources the way gardeners cultivated orchids, with obsessive attention and mysterious methods that produced beautiful results. "Maybe," Vance replied, her tone noncommittal, "if the Joint Chiefs approve the operation, if Vienna Station provides adequate support, if approximately 17 other variables align in our favor." Wade's laugh came through the speakers like static, warm and skeptical simultaneously. "You're going to Vienna," he repeated with absolute certainty. "They'll approve it. They always approve your operations because you've never failed one, and failure is the only thing that organization actually punishes." He wasn't wrong. Her operational record was unblemished in the way that new cars are unblemished, absolutely pristine, because they haven't been driven long enough to accumulate damage. "Is there a point to this call, Master Chief, or are you just checking in?" Vance asked, her voice carrying affection despite its flat delivery, warmth despite its apparent indifference. They'd maintained this relationship for 6 years, ever since she'd graduated from training, with scores high enough to be either impressive or suspicious, depending on your perspective. Wade had chosen impressive and appointed himself her unofficial mentor, providing guidance she hadn't requested but desperately needed, offering perspective she couldn't generate from inside her own limited experience. "The point," Wade said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "is that the target you're hunting isn't just building a network, he's building a legacy." Vance's hands tightened on the steering wheel, the only external sign of internal reaction. "Intel suggests something different. They're showing recruitment patterns consistent with establishing a private military company, not ideological infrastructure." Wade made a dismissive sound. "Intel is looking at data. I'm looking at psychology. This guy didn't rebuild because he needed money or power. He rebuilt because you took something from him, and now he wants to return the favor." The rain intensified, forcing Vance to increase wiper speed, the blades now moving fast enough to create a stroboscopic effect against the windshield. "You're saying this is personal." Wade's confirmation came immediately. "I'm saying this is revenge dressed up as recruitment. And revenge operations are unpredictable in ways that standard tactical planning can't accommodate. Watch yourself in Vienna, Keelhaul. Competent enemies are dangerous. Competent enemies with personal motivation are lethal." The line went dead before she could respond, leaving her alone with the rain and the traffic and the growing certainty that the briefing she just delivered had understated the complexity of what she was walking into. She drove for another 20 minutes, arriving finally at an apartment building in Arlington that looked exactly like every other apartment building in Arlington, functional, forgettable, designed for transient military personnel who needed housing but not homes. Her apartment was on the 4th floor, accessible via stairs. She climbed two at a time, despite the exhaustion beginning to weight her movements. Inside, the space was almost aggressively impersonal. Minimal furniture, no photographs, no decorations beyond a single piece of abstract art that had come with the lease, and that she'd never bothered to remove. The only personal item visible was a shadow box on the wall containing her trident, her combat ribbons, and a single playing card, the Queen of Spades sign by every member of her first team. The card had been a joke initially, a reference to her call sign and her gender, but it had transformed over time into something more significant, a symbol of competence earned rather than assumed, respect granted rather than demanded. She stood looking at it for a long moment, reading signatures she'd memorized years ago, thinking about men who'd followed her into places where following might mean dying. Her phone vibrated with an incoming email marked classified eyes only. She opened it on her secured tablet, reading authorization orders that had been approved in record time, exactly as Wade had predicted. Vienna station had been alerted. Support assets were being positioned. She had 72 hours to assemble a team and deploy. The email concluded with a single line from the four-star admiral. "Bring them home, Commander. All of them." It was an impossible order phrased as encouragement, the kind of directive that acknowledged reality while demanding the miraculous anyway. She composed a response of exactly 3 words. "Understood. Moving forward." Then she opened a different secure application and began reviewing personnel files, searching for 3 other operators willing to walk into Vienna's Baroque architecture and shadowy intelligence networks, hunting a target who might be hunting them right back. The rain continued outside, washing the city clean while darkness gathered in corners that daylight couldn't reach, and Commander Vance planned her operation with the meticulous care of someone who understood that in her profession, mistakes weren't learning opportunities. They were epitaphs written in classified after action, reports that no one except other operators would ever read. 72 hours wasn't enough time. It never was. But she'd work with what she had because that's what operators did. They took insufficient resources and inadequate preparation and impossible odds, and they found ways to succeed anyway, or they died trying. Either way, the mission continued with or without them. Another name added to classified memorial walls or another operation marked successful in files that would remain sealed for 50 years. Vance pulled up the first personnel file, studying the face of a weapons specialist who'd worked 3 operations with her previously, deciding whether he belonged on this team or whether bringing him would be asking him to walk into something his skills couldn't overcome. Outside, Arlington slept or pretended to sleep, its residents dreaming civilian dreams while in apartments scattered throughout the city. Other operators received similar emails, read similar orders, made similar calculations about risk and necessity. The machinery of special operations ground forward incrementally, powered by people who'd volunteered for work that couldn't be fully explained, and that often couldn't be survived, who did it anyway because someone had to, and they'd decided that someone would be them. Vance closed the first file, opened a second, continued her review while rain drummed its endless rhythm against windows that reflected her face back to her, showing a woman who looked tired and young and absolutely determined to see this through to whatever end waited in Vienna's shadows. The call sign keelhaul carried weight she couldn't fully escape, but she'd learned to bear it the way sailors learned to bear tattoos, permanent markers of who they'd become through experiences that had fundamentally altered them. Staff Sergeant Morrison was probably drinking somewhere right now, trying to process his encounter, trying to understand how he'd misjudged someone so completely based on nothing but appearance and assumption. She hoped he learned from it. She hoped he'd pass that lesson to others. She hoped the next young female officer who walked into a room where she didn't appear to belong would face slightly less skepticism, because Morrison had learned something about the gap between perception and reality. But hopping was different from believing, and Vance had learned long ago to hope for the best while planning for the worst, to move through the world with cautious optimism backed by tactical contingencies that assumed humans would fail at being better, because humans usually did. She selected 3 operators for the Vienna mission, sending encrypted messages that would require face-to-face confirmation, setting up meetings at locations chosen for security and symbolism places, where serious conversations could happen away from ears that might be listening. Then she closed her tablet, drew her service weapon from its secure box, and began the ritual of cleaning it despite having fired 0 rounds since the last cleaning, because rituals mattered in professions where chaos was the default state and control was mostly illusion. Tomorrow she'd brief her team. Tomorrow she'd review Vienna's layout and identify safe houses and establish extraction protocols. Tomorrow she'd transform from a woman who'd been grabbed by a Marine in a briefing room into Commander Vance, call sign Keelhaul, the youngest SEAL commander in history, leading another operation that officially wouldn't exist in locations that officially weren't hostile, hunting people who officially posed no threat to national security. But tonight, she was just exhausted, just human, just someone who defended her right to occupy space that others assumed belonged to someone else, and wondering how many more times she'd have to prove the same competence before it became assumed rather than questioned. The rain provided no answers, only continuation, only the steady rhythm of water meeting earth, persistent and patient and ultimately unstoppable, exactly like her.